that really is the most obvious way you can use in a contract. For a supplier, don't get locked into a battle of standard contracts. Now, it's probably unlikely, or maybe I'm wrong, but I think most of you will not have maybe your own standard contract. You'll probably work with whatever contract your clients give you. That's fine. But for those of you who perhaps have enough business volume to justify having your own standard contracts, try to use them wherever possible, because it's always good to maintain a consistent risk profile with your business, which you can do by using the same contract. But if it doesn't work, don't get locked into this whole battle of whose contract you have to use and why there's a disaster if you can't use your contract. It's a waste of time. Think of it as the other way around, that fine, we'll use your contract and have certain clauses that just say things like, we'll accept everything else in your contract, that's fine, but for this particular bit, our contract applies, or this particular clause applies. So deal with specific issues which you think are a problem in the other party's contracts. Don't worry about whether they don't look like your documents, or they're not worded exactly the same. It's typically not worth the time. Non-compete clauses are a big problem. And again, this is something I've seen more with American clients, where there are often very, very extensive non-compete clauses, some to the point where they say you can't even provide services similar to the services you provide to us for anybody else without our written consent. Now, on the assumption that most of your services are broadly similar that you provide to most of your clients, that would lock you out from providing any services to anybody else, which is clearly nuts. So the point I'm trying to make is there's a big difference between confidentiality and non-compete. It is absolutely reasonable to say you can't disclose what we give you, our confidential information, to anybody else. That's fine. What is not fine is to say, or to have provisions in a contract which effectively block you from doing business with other people using your know-how, which is not confidential information. So be very careful before you sign up to these things. And in my experience, when you've explained that to the clients, typically they will see. Most of the time these sort of standard contracts represent one party's best case scenario. They don't necessarily think they'll get away with all of it. So you must feel comfortable asking for changes, asking people to explain to you why they think it's necessary, or explaining to them why it's actually a big risk if you agree to it. Don't give away all your know-how and skills. This is another pet hate of mine, you could almost say. Often intellectual property, there's often a definition of intellectual property, includes all your know-how and assets. Now, that's all very good, but strictly speaking, know-how is not IPR. You are going to use the same know-how that you've used for client A to deliver your services to client B. It doesn't mean that you're using client A's confidential information. No, it just means you're using the knowledge of certain processes, how things work, your business management, your project management skills to deliver similar service to somebody else. Now, you can't possibly assign those things to one client. There's no sense in that. There's also no justification for somebody wanting that. So be aware of that. As a service provider, your know-how and your skills, that's your assets. Unless you're in the business of developing original IP, your know-how is what you make money from. How quickly, how efficiently you do something. How well you understand certain processes. You can't give those away to any one particular client. From the client's point of view, it's kind of the mirror image in many ways. If you're a client, don't withhold material information. And I never cease being surprised by the amount of times I hear service providers say, well, there's a delay here because we've asked the client to give us X, Y, or Z, and the client is just not comfortable releasing this to us because they're not sure how we need it. Now, that's not the way to approach it. The contract has confidentiality obligations most of the time. So as a client, you may not always be sure why your service provider is asking for something, but you've got to trust in your service provider's professionalism, and you've got to be able to rely on the comfort that service provider has given you. If it's not necessary, it's not necessary, but you still have the comfort of confidentiality. So if something is material, give it to your service provider. Don't keep changing the scope unless that is actually anticipated at the outset. Don't keep telling the service provider, we've changed our mind, we actually need this now. It's just not going to work. It's an obvious thing, but you'd be surprised how many clients don't think about that. It just happens all the time. And don't tell the supplier how to do its job. We went through that. Concentrate on what you need. Right, commercial. What are the lessons we can learn from mainstream outsourcing? Think about what the project is intended to achieve, and don't start negotiating or arguing about things which are actually not central to the objective of the project. It's a business deal after all. Legal should never take front stage. If legal stuff takes front stage, you're doing things the wrong way. It is a business deal. Check capabilities and experience, and this goes both ways. If your client says your client is going to test things based on which your payment is dependent, make sure you're comfortable that your client actually has the resources, the knowledge, the skills to test. Often that is not the case. Cooperate. Don't rely on contracts and say, oh my God, the contract says I can't do this, so no. Ask, if a certain request comes in which you're not comfortable with, ask, cooperate, work with your client or work with your service provider. Beware of fixed price deals. From a commercial point of view, the largest amount of deals I've seen go sour are fixed price services deals. Because invariably, service providers will want to provide as little as possible for that price or not change the scope much. And invariably, the client will want to include much more than originally agreed. And manage the contract. Don't just sign it, put it in a drawer, forget about it. Actually make sure you diarize dates in the contract, make sure you follow them up. From the legal point of view, it's fairly straightforward. Scope and specs. Make sure you know what it is you're providing, what price, what format. Deal with ownership of IPRs and other assets. Also deal with change of service providers. It's probably more important from a client's point of view. But if you're dealing with outsourced services, it's very possible that you will ask somebody else to provide those sort of services at some point. And your contract should deal with that eventuality and also set out certain things like, will you ask your current service provider to help? What kind of assistance is to be provided? This actually has very serious ramifications in some jurisdictions where the law will determine that the service provider has certain obligations. So if you're dealing with clients internationally, make sure you look into this. And consider framework agreements. If you're working again and again with one client or with one service provider, consider having a framework agreement which sets out your overall commercial relationship and which then enables you to just draw off specific work orders, specific jobs. Some of the myths which some will go through, often you see these sort of arguments and you've got to sign up to these warranties because we've got to give them to the publisher. You can't change them. It's nuts. Your client and you have different risk profiles. You're in different places in the business. Just because your client has to give certain warranties to the publisher doesn't mean you have to give exactly the same mirror images warranties to your client. You're in a very different place. Think about what you're doing and what warranty is reasonable with what you are doing. It's not what your client is doing with a publisher. The client often says, we must be able to terminate and walk away. No. Even if you agree that your client can terminate any time, fine. Make sure that the contract stipulates that payment has to be made. You must deal with that. However your client can terminate, any work that is done which your client accepts has to be paid for. Whether it's formally accepted or not, doesn't matter. If your client wants to continue developing it further in-house, they pay for it. It's very simple. Everything you do in relation to this job belongs to us. Again, it's there in almost every service contract. Sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes it isn't. Think about what you're doing. This goes back to the know-how and skill set thing. Are you really comfortable giving your client everything that you've generated in this job? Will you be using any of this for anybody else? Think about this before you agree. And finally, just to put all of this in context, you may not be able to read this from there. What it says is, we've considered every potential risk except the risk of avoiding all risks. So that's just to put all of the legal stuff in context. Don't let it overtake the actual business. There is a place for legal arguments, legal contract work, etc., etc. But if you've done your job right in your commercial discussions, the legal work should not be as big as I've often seen it. So spend some time in advance, get your lawyers involved early. I know it's not the most fascinating aspect of this business, but if you do it properly, it can save you a lot of headache down the line. And that's it. If you have any questions, I'd be...
Roy. My name is Kulvinder.
Right.
From NSAT. What I've realized or seen most often is legal taking the precedence.
Industry, so QA, localization, testing, you name it. They provide services to people in Europe, in the US. I work with one or two people in India as well. And what we've noticed is that, I don't know how many of you are all familiar with mainstream IT outsourcing, sort of BPO type stuff, but generally, you know, the legal stuff tends to be incredibly complex. You've got volumes of books almost, that's how big the contracts are. Now, as far as video game services goes, initially, really, as people yesterday also said, I think the industry started as a pure service delivery option where somebody told you, this is what we want, this is how much you get paid, and that's it. It's fairly simple from the legal point of view, but it has gotten a lot more complex. And as a few people said yesterday, a lot of service providers these days are not just service providers in the sense that there are fixed deliverables and you deliver and you get paid, that's it. It's actually much more of a consultative process where the service provider is actually part of and has an input in the deliverable. And what we've seen is that the contracts have accordingly got quite complex as well, increasingly so, and more they resemble now the contracts used in IT outsourcing. Now, even if the deal value is nothing like a big BPO outsourcing deal, the same principles apply. And the reason I'm here is that I was speaking to a few people on the Indian sort of service and developer side, and what we noticed was that there were a lot of misconceptions about contractual issues when dealing with clients who are based mostly in the West. And a lot of these things have been learned the very hard way by service providers who are based outside. And there's no reason why people here have to go through all the hiccups, shall we say. You can actually, even if your deals, even if the relevant projects are not huge, there is a right way and a wrong way to deal with contracts. And one thing I've noticed is that a lot of people, the pressures you work under. But what you have to understand is that you're also dealing with two different models. Your internal company lawyer should not be acting as a brake to your business. If that is what happens with your internal lawyer, then you've not set the lines correctly. You've not drawn the lines correctly. You've not correctly ascertained what the lawyer's input is to be. Your external lawyer is always going to be extremely paranoid because your external lawyer is worried about you coming back and saying, you gave me wrong advice, I lost X amount of money, pay me back. That's what your external lawyer is going to be worried about. Your internal lawyer should be used in a very different way. You should be very clear with your internal lawyer that we want your input in these matters. It should be more about risk education. In my personal opinion, it's